This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 277 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's about languages and connection and the way that having a common language with the local people when you travel can make for a really connecting experience. I've got lots of things to tell you. Before we get into that, let me acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, where I am living and recording this podcast in this beautiful land of ours. So, on to languages. I have definitely mentioned in previous episodes that I love languages. I can speak German well, and I managed to reach a passable conversational level of Japanese when I lived in Osaka. And I've definitely always tried to know and learn at least a few key phrases of the language wherever I go. And I know that many of you are the same. It definitely always pays off. It's much easier to connect with locals, and I've had lots of rewarding experiences that I don't think I would have had without more language. But at the same time, I don't think it has to be a lot of language, and it's fine to use a phrasebook or these days Google Translate to help for sure. But I have a very vivid memory on the Trans-Siberian on one of those very long sections, playing checkers with a group of kids on my bunk. The kids, I don't know, 3 or 4 kids about 10 years old or so, using their tiny amount of school kid English and a little bit of Russian study I'd done ahead of the trip and a phrase book. And we all got ourselves understood. We learned a lot from each other and we had heaps of fun. So it's one of those, special connecting moments that I think without a bit of language in common, it probably wouldn't have happened. So anyway, in today's episode, I've got 3 guests to tell some of their tales about language and connection, but I'm going to add in some snippets throughout from other sources as well. So some of them are stories from the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group members, and also some info from some academic research about this topic, because there's lots to discuss. But I want to start with a story from a listener, from Anuj, because I just love this story and it illustrates my point perfectly. So Anuj told us about this in the Facebook group, and he said, "Both my wife and I learned Spanish before we visited Latin America. While in Costa Rica one day at a restaurant, the waiter saw us looking at pamphlets for excursions in Monteverde. He approached us for help, but he didn't know English. We started speaking in enough Spanish that he understood what we were trying to do. He offered us some help with all the different activities that Monteverde offers. He took us to a place where we could do waterfall canyoning. After the activity, he took us to his house and we met his family. It was one of the best days of our lives." So I love that story, and especially the end, because obviously it's a memory that's really stayed with Anuj and his wife, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't happen unless you have this language connection in common, and it's just a beautiful story. So my first snippet from a guest from a recording is from Eliza Raymond from Good Travel, and she describes very succinctly what languages and connection is all about.
If you ever have played that desert island game or some of those party games, one of them is like, what's the one wish? If you could have any wish in the world, what would it be? And mine is always to be able to speak every language in the world, because I do think that just, if I compare kind of my different travel experiences in different countries, always the ones where I could speak the local language have been where I've been able to really form friendships and really get to know people and had the truly meaningful and most memorable experiences. Mm-hmm. And so I do think, taking time to, of course, do your research about the local history and culture and that kind of thing, but to have that really personal, individual connection with people, having a common language is so important.
So yes, I completely agree that having that common language makes a huge difference. And my next guest is James Patterson, and he has a great story from a stint in Orkney. He's actually spent 9 months there in total. I think he's had a stint of 6 and a stint of about 3 months living on the Orkney Islands. And he has a great story that illustrates this point perfectly.
I've moved around quite a bit in my life, and one of the places I lived most recently was Orkney, which is an archipelago off the north coast of Scotland. It doesn't really matter where you move. I find that places can be quite difficult to penetrate, but as a writer, I find language is one of the best places to enter a culture. And so I'm a bit of a kayaker, and I take my kayak around. I have a folding kayak, so portable, and I took my kayak up to Orkney with me when I was living there. And there's great kayaking there. They have big cliffs. They have lots of nasty seas, lots of sheltered bays, lots of birds. You can go out and watch the birds. So I would go down to the beach. I would go to the cliffs, and I would just kayak around, and I would meet people at those places. They would always be saying things like, "Oh, it's a turlish today," or "It's gushly," and you think, "What the hell are these people talking about?" And I mean, Orcadian has sort of developed as its own. It used to be its own language, and then as the sort of English infused into it, it became this dialect. It's a dialect now. And in Orkney they have it's 9 words for wind, and it goes queel, turl, girl, gushel, hushel, scolder, scuther, gouster, screever. So that's everything from sort of the tiny little breeze, the queel, you could barely feel it on your skin, up to the turl and the girl, and then maybe the gushel and the hushel are getting kind of. I mean, these sound like dwarves in The Hobbit or something. Yeah. And, I mean, by the time you get to the screever, you can't even stand up straight.
Right. Yeah, screever sounds terrible.
Yeah, it does. It's a real sort of. It's got the scree of a scream. It is very evocative. And I mean, they've got 17 words for drizzle. They have a word for the wind that comes down your chimney and blows apart your fireplace. Moves the soot around in the fireplace. And so, I mean, Orkney was sort of a bit of an enigma before I started to hear these words and use them myself. And then even as an outsider, if you're using these little words that I hesitate to say local, because it doesn't matter who it is, because once you start to use them, you sort of become that person too, the islander. Well, actually, they do call islanders blow-ins there, funnily enough, another wind term.
Another wind word,
but, yeah. So I just using that language was the way for me to sort of, I guess, ingratiate myself into the place, and then you feel like a real local. I was living on a sort of a little cottage on a farm, and I remember I said to the farmer, "Oh yeah," he was talking to me, and he said, "Oh, you're from Canada." And I said, "Yeah, I'm from Canada. Have you ever thought about going there?" Like a lot of Orcadians went to Canada, and they were part of the first group of Brits who went to North America during the fur trade. The Hudson Bay Company was made up of 80% Orcadian men. So Canada has this big link with Orkney. So we were talking about this, and I said, "Would you like to go to Canada?" And he said, "Oh, maybe if I could be at home in time for tea."
It's a little bit further than that.
It's a little bit far, too far for tea, but it's a very. I don't mean to use the word parochial in a negative sense, but it's a very parochial place where they have Orcadians have gone around the world. They've gone to Australia. There's plenty of Orcadians in Australia. They've gone to Canada, like I said, South Africa, all these sort of British colonial places. But they are very homebound, and these words are very important to them. It's their way to maintain their sense of self as more foreigners come in and live there and support the population. And so by learning those words, it's sort of a great way to find your own kind of home there, find your own place. And I think, that's a good way to just move around the world in general, is find the thing in any place where you are a little bit at home.
Such a good tip, I think. Find the way into the really local language. It reminds me of when I lived in southwest Germany, where they speak the Swabian dialect or Schwäbisch, and over time I picked up some of that, often without realising it, I have to confess. Was it, real German or Schwäbisch? Sometimes I didn't really know, but because I was immersed in it, I suppose I used it, and people would say, "Oh, you sound like a real local," and they really liked that. So it's sort of unintentional, but same effect. A quick story, another one from the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group, just because it's a lovely, fun interaction that couldn't happen without having a common language. It's from Carolanna, who's been a guest on the podcast before, and she's just moved to Kaohsiung in Taiwan, which is a bit exciting. I'm a little bit envious. Anyway, her story was yesterday when I was walking in a park and an elderly man speaking Chinese asked me where I was from. When I told him I was American, he insisted I couldn't be American. When I asked him why I wasn't American, he said, "Americans are tall." And Carolanna said, "I'm 5 foot 2 inches or 157 centimetres. I laughed so hard." And what a delightful interaction that one assumes definitely couldn't have happened if Carolanna didn't speak with him in his local language. Now, there's also a lot of really interesting research that I found. I like to do these deep dives into the academic archives too, because I always fear that the academic research just lingers there and nobody ever gets to find out the good bits. So anyway, I came across a treasure trove of research from Inês Carvalho, a Portuguese researcher. And she's mentioned a lot that connecting with community really happens when you know the local language. So there's an example she gave from a study by Kennett. And just to quote Inês Carvalho's summary of it, she said that Kennett analysed participants' deep connection with Japan and their long commitment to learning Japanese outside the classroom. Knowing the language allowed them to have more authentic experiences in the quote-unquote back regions or quote-unquote tourist-free zones in Japan, i.e. untouched by formal tourism. And I think that that is one of the very special parts of it all. And these kinds of encounters are hard to discover without having some kind of local language. So Justin from the Facebook group, my book club co-host, mentioned a kind of a practical example of this. He said, "Speaking a bit of Spanish really helped in Cuba, much more so than any other Latin American country. I think because I stayed at Casas Particulares, which are Cuban homestays, and it enabled me to have some nice conversations with the locals. My stay in Vinales was memorable because the host made me a coffee from coffee plants in his garden." That's very cool. "And then we drank whiskey one night while watching the baseball final series. It also led me astray on a horse ride as my guide led me to a thatched hut in the middle of nowhere to try and sell me Cuban cigars." I'm sure Justin's told me that story before. I'm not sure if it's been on a podcast episode, but it's a really good example of gaining entry into the back regions, as the research suggests, of really getting to know a country in a different way. Now, the examples that I've been listing today from my guests and from our Facebook group members have mostly been concerned with, I guess, fairly mainstream languages that a lot of people would learn. But there was a really interesting bit in the research I found about the case where people learn, much rarer languages. So it was from these same studies by Inês Carvalho and an unnamed person named Participant 17 in the research said that he felt his ability to learn uncommon languages through his travels to remote locations would often surprise the locals, who in turn made him feel special, which in turn became a memorable experience for him. And he stated, "So obviously you become very special. They start doing things for you that are special, offering you something they wouldn't normally offer anybody. It's like you've honoured them by learning their language and nobody else has ever done that, and it's like, wow." So he was described in the research as a hyper-polyglot, which I don't know how many languages you have to know to be a hyper-polyglot, but in this instance he was talking about speaking in Nepali and Tamang with Tamang people in Nepal. So I have experienced just at a normal level learning like a language like Japanese, that the locals are very appreciative of that. But I can imagine if you spoke a language that nobody really expects anybody to learn, that they would be very, very pleased and, give you some special treatment. So I thought that was a really interesting point from the research. Now, my final guest today is Kayra Martinez, and Kayra has a very long history of learning languages, which I will let her explain first.
When I was in the States, I took some Spanish courses, but they taught me in English, and it didn't really it wasn't impressionable during that time in my life. When I moved to Europe in 97 and I was living in London, I was traveling every month on a mini vacation. So I would pick Poland or Italy or Spain, and I would go for 1 week. And one of my best friends, unfortunately she's not with us anymore, but she told me, wherever you go, always tell them thank you in their language. And it just, every time I went somewhere, I would always learn a little bit of their language. And I noticed that when I spoke to them, their eyes lit up when I just said thank you, dziękuję bardzo in Polish, and all of a sudden they would become so happy. This little American girl was speaking Polish. So yeah. I realized how impactful a few words were. And so also because of my travels and because of the places that I was living, like in Germany, and I lived in Poland for a short time, and I studied in Italy and Spain, then I decided I would take some classes. And because I have a lot of time off, then I would study for like a month, 2 months. And yeah, so I've studied German, Spanish, Polish, Italian, and Spanish. Right now I'm taking Greek lessons online and learning Arabic from the people.
Oh, wow.
I'm not fluent in all of those languages, but I feel like a very big pool and a yearning to learn so many languages as I can.
So the time off that Kayra refers to is time in between her shifts. She works as a flight attendant and so can have some longer stints where she can be travelling, or in the past few years spending time in Greece. She's done a lot of work helping out, volunteering, running all kinds of programs in a refugee camp in Greece. And we got to talking a bit more about that and how language learning helped with the connections being made within the refugee camp as well. In the refugee camps, so there's people there from varying backgrounds with various languages. Do they also have language classes for the refugees in the camp?
Yes, so the camp I worked in, Nea Kavala in northern Greece, we had a makeshift school. There were some volunteers mostly from the UK. After about 3 months of doing distributions in the camp, I realized that handing out shoes, handing out clothes, we're not allowed to talk with them. It just wasn't for me. I thought, am I coming here to do this work and I can't even communicate with them or sit down with them? So I moved over to the school and I started to teach English and German. Mm-hmm. I've literally had every job on the planet during the 6 years. And so what I realized is when I was with the children and they were, learning from these teachers, is they are so smart and they have such a passion to learn. And so all of this time in the refugee camps is just wasted time, and it's so, they see a lot of the stress from their parents, so they feel that. And so by us taking them, separating them a little bit and teaching them English and German and painting, it was truly healing in every way. And I speak with a lot of the kids now still. This is after many years that they've left already, several years. And now we're speaking in German together. And it's so sweet because before it was me with my funny Arabic and their English.
Wow.
And we were always just trying to communicate through hand gestures. But they've really, given the chance now that they have formal schooling in Germany and Holland and the other countries that they've moved to, they've really learned so quickly. So I think language was one of I think the top priorities that I would say that the children need in a refugee camp.
So I think the example of connecting through language in a refugee camp is one of the most important kind of areas where we really want to be able to make connections between people. So, lots to think about. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So don't forget to come and chat about this episode, either in the Facebook group or the LinkedIn group. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in both places, or see the links in the show notes and we'll be able to connect up there. So big thanks to the guests who contributed to this episode, both to the fabulous people in my Facebook group, but also to the guests who recorded some interviews with me. I've got more to come from each of them, but these were some snippets on this particular topic. So first of all, thanks to Eliza Raymond of Good Travel. You can find out more about Good Travel, which is a fabulous company in New Zealand, at good-travel.org. I next chatted with the writer James Patterson, and you can find his website about some of his excellent writing at jrpatterson.ca. That's Patterson with 2 T's. And lastly, Kayra Martinez, who still helps out with refugees in northern Greece and has an organisation that helps where you can also help. It's called Love Without Borders for Refugees.com, the 4 being the number 4, and of course the links will be in the show notes. I'll also leave a link in the show notes to some of that research that I mentioned, which was published in the Tourism and Hospitality Research Journal. So all of these links that I keep mentioning will be in the show notes, which for this episode you'll find at notaballerina.com/277. So do come and let me know your own thoughts about the connections you've made when you've been travelling and had at least a cursory knowledge of the language, or perhaps a deep knowledge. Also curious to hear from anyone who's had, who knows a more unique, rare language, a less spoken language, let's say, or who's made the effort to learn it, and any interesting experiences that come along with that. Makes me wonder what I'll be learning next. Who knows? In the meantime, as always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.